Hey, it's Kat, and I'm back because what once was will be again, at least if we use history, mythology, and sometimes astrology to divine the mysteries of the Game of Thrones. So in this segment, we're going to talk about Lightbringer the sword, blacksmiths, and the number 3. If you know anything about our story of A Song of Ice and Fire or Game of Thrones, then you know that there is this magical sword that's been prophesied. According to the prophecy of Azor Ahai and the prince that was promised, or the legend, when once upon a time Azor Ahai forged a sword. Well, actually, he forged 3 swords. And the first time he forged a sword for 30 days and 30 nights. And when he was done, he tried to temper it in water and it shattered. Then he tried to forge the sword again. And he forged this sword for 50 days and 50 nights. And this time, he captured a lion and tried to temper the sword in the heart of a lion. But the sword shattered. And then he worked on this sword for 100 days and 100 nights. And when it was done, he knew what he had to do. So he called forth his most loving wife, Nisa, and drove his sword into her heart. And with a cry and a shout of ecstasy, he drew the sword from her heart, and it was imbued with her fiery spirit, and it was a light, and he called the sword Lightbringer. Of course, if you've been following us all along, or you've checked out our Lightbringer series, then you know I actually said that Lightbringer is a woman, and it still is. But I also said that there was a sword. Because when you look at prophecy, prophecy isn't just literal. Sometimes it's metaphorical, and sometimes it's both literal and metaphorical. As an example of a literal prophecy, we know the prophecy of Cersei. And when she was a young girl, she went to see Maggie the Frog, and she told her that one day, in fact, she would marry a king, and that she would have 3 children. And gold would be their shrouds, i.e. they would die. And then Cersei would be a queen, but only for a short period of time before one that was younger and more beautiful came to pull her down. And then the Voluncar, the little brother, will put his hands around her neck and strangle her. Of course, if you've been watching this series all along, then you know that that actually happened. Cersei married Robert Baratheon. She had 3 children, actually, by her brother, Jaime. And all 3 of her children are dead, and now she sits on the throne as queen, and we are waiting breathlessly for Daenerys, or whomever the younger queen is, to come to pull her down, and then Jaime or Tyrion or Arya, dressed as somebody, to come and put their hands around her neck and strangle her. Of course, prophecy can be metaphorical as well. One of those metaphorical prophecies is the one that Daenerys receives from Mirri Maz Duur, when Daenerys asks her if she will ever have a child again and if she will see Khal Drogo. Well, Mirri Maz Duur says to her, "When the sun rises in the west and sets in the east, then will your womb quicken and Khal Drogo will rise again." Well, if you look at that prophecy, you're pretty damn sure that if you took that literally, that is never going to happen, because the sun doesn't rise in the west. It always rises in the east. It is physically impossible. So the answer for Daenerys would be never, unless you took that prophecy metaphorically. In fact, we see it happening right now in the Game of Thrones. So if the sun sets in the east, i.e. Daenerys is leaving the east, she's leaving Essos, and she's going to the west, where the sun will rise. And in fact, we see the sun symbol as the sun in splendor, as one of the people that are supporting her. So the sun is going to rise in the west. And yeah, Daenerys is probably going to be pregnant. But what's this deal about Khal Drogo rising again? Well, you have to go check our Lightbringer series, where we talk about Lightbringer being the star Venus, and that's Daenerys, because it's the sign of the goddess. And that as she travels through the path of Venus, that eventually, after going east and then going west, she will eventually go east again, where she'll disappear for a short period of time. And then, yes, the star Venus rises in the summer sky in conjunction with the sun. And Khal Drogo was Daenerys' son. Okay, so now you get that prophecy can be literal or it can be metaphorical. But prophecy can also be literal and metaphorical at the same time. And it can apply to a lot of people and things. And this is the theory that we're going on. In fact, one of those very interesting prophecies and or literal / metaphorical instances is something that Mr. Martin said himself. When he was asked about prophecy in the story of A Song of Ice and Fire, he said that prophecy is like a sword without a hilt. And then he explains to you the metaphorical meaning, which is, you could try to grasp this sword, but as soon as you think you've got it in hand, it slips out. Because that's what happens when a sword doesn't have a hilt. It falls out your hand. You can't hold on to it. So that's a metaphorical meaning. But if you look at it through literal meaning, he's saying that the sword of prophecy is broken. That's right, everybody. The sword that everybody's looking for is broken. And how do we know? Well, Mr. Martin told you. Not only did he tell you there, but he told you that he is a super big fan of J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. And the most famous sword in the Lord of the Rings is the sword Anduril. This sword belonged to Aragorn II's father. And this sword was broken in the War of the Last Alliance. And then the pieces were taken by the elves and placed on a statue of Aragorn's father. And then later, when Aragorn is getting ready to go on this quest regarding a ring, the elves take this sword and they reforge it. And it is stronger and better than ever before. And they name it Anduril. And it means the flame of the West. And according to J.R.R. Tolkien, it was a very bright sword when made whole again. Light of the sun shone red through it, and light of the moon shone cold. And it had runes on the blades, and it spelled out the word sun, and then the lineage of the sword, and then the word moon. And like Mr. Martin, J.R.R. Tolkien actually took his storyline from Norse mythology. And in Norse mythology, the most famous sword that was broken was the sword called Gram, which means wrath. And this sword had been crafted by the legendary blacksmith Wayland. According to mythology, it was a gleaming bright sword decked with gold, and it was brown of hue, which I'll pause right now and tell you that brown of hue is what happens to a sword when it is dipped in red dye. I watched the whole process, a whole video about the process of making Viking swords and how they would put it into different colors. And one of those colors was red, and when it came out, it was sort of a reddish brown color. In any event, on this sword, Gram, a dragon was emblazoned. And according to the legend of Azor Ahai, when he draws forth Lightbringer, he is drawing forth the red sword of heroes. According to mythology, the king Volsung was having a feast, and he had many honored guests there, when an old man strode into their midst, bearing this sword. It was Odin in disguise. And Odin walked up to the branstock, which is a tree growing in the middle of the hall of the Volsungs, and he drove this sword into the tree. And then he said that any man who could draw the sword would be the most worthy, and he would receive a gift from Odin. And of course, right at this moment, you might actually recognize the basis for Arthurian legend, wherein there is a sword driven into something that only the most worthy may draw. And this thing, the branstock, some historians have actually translated it not to be an actual living tree growing through the hall, but in fact that the word brand means burning, that it was a giant burning log laying in the hearth in the center of this hall, which you get when you see Stannis and the sword that was driven into the burning effigies of the gods. And obviously, since we know that that was not actually the real Lightbringer that Stannis drew out of that fire, then you get the idea that no, it was not a burning log. It was in fact a living tree, just like that freaking tree that's outside of Winterfell. And as the legend goes, of course, every dude at the feast tried to draw this sword out of the tree. And finally it gets down to King Volsung's youngest son, Sigmund. And he goes up to the tree and he easily pulls this sword out. And of course, all of the other guests are not only amazed, they are jealous and angry. Not to mention this one King Sigurd, who apparently is a really cruel and evil bastard. Of course, King Sigurd's there for one freaking reason only, and that is that he's there to marry the daughter of King Volsung, kind of like what we see in our Game of Thrones, where Robert Baratheon comes and he tells Ned he wants him to be his hand, but he also wants his daughter to marry his son, Joffrey, who is a really cruel and evil little bastard. And just like in our story of Game of Thrones, King Sigurd, taking his bride back with him to his land, invites Sigmund and his brothers to come visit him with King Volsung. And when they arrive there, King Sigurd has King Volsung killed, kind of like Ned getting beheaded. And then he takes the sons captive and he ties them to the trees in the forest, and they're all eaten by a wolf except one. And that is the youngest, Sigmund. And you might have noticed that whenever Ned's sons' wolves die, they die with them, i.e. they are being consumed by the wolf. Well, eventually Sigmund figures out how to outwit this wolf, and he breaks free, and his sister gives him the sword. This sword, Graham. And then he proceeds to kill King Sigurd amongst all of his children, and he does some other things, but maybe the most important thing that he goes and does is that he goes and fights the battle with the king of Lyngvi. Now, the Lyngvi is an island in the Blackwater Lake, i.e. the Bay of Blackwater. And as he's in the midst of this battle, Odin comes and interferes in the battle because Lyngvi is the island on which Fenrir the wolf is bound. And if King Lyngvi dies, then it sets in motion the next part of the prophecy, which is Fenrir the wolf will break loose and Ragnarok comes. So Odin interferes in the battle and he causes the sword Graham to be shattered, and Sigmund receives a mortal wound. Okay, so this is pretty much that. Ned went down there to King's Landing, and then due to some backstabbing, just like in our story of Sigmund, he was killed, and that was his sword was taken by Tywin Lannister, aka Odin in this matter. And he had the sword broken and reforged into two swords, Oathkeeper and one that Joffrey later named the Widow's Well. According to the books, Ned's sword Ice was actually a smoky hue, but when Tywin had it melted down, he made Tobo Mott add red to the swords because he wanted them to bear the colors of their house, which were red and gold. According to the legend of Sigmund, he had a wife, and he called her to him as he lay dying, and he prophesied to her that she was pregnant and she was going to give birth to a son when he was dead, and that she was to take the two pieces of his sword and hold them for his son, so that when his son grew to manhood, he could take the sword and avenge Sigmund's death. As you might guess, the sword was reforged by another legendary blacksmith, who foretells the return of Gendry. But is this the sword of prophecy? And keep in mind that according to the legend of Azor Ahai, he actually tries to forge the sword 3 times. And once he tempers it in water and it shatters. The other time he tries to temper it in the heart of a lion that he has captured, and it shatters again. Could we say that this is actually what happens in the story of Ned Stark and his sword that's broken into 2? Because he did try to unseat the Lannisters from the throne, and he did have that sword fight with Jaime that he almost won until somebody stabbed him in the back. You could say that Ned tried to stick a sword into the heart of the lion. And there is this other sword out there that looks a lot like Andoril, complete with the little star in the pommel. What's it all mean exactly? Well, we're going to find out together. So you should come back and check the next segment when we talk about the reforging of the legendary sword Graham, the legendary blacksmith that does it, and the legendary hero that wields it. Thank you very much. Hit the like button, leave a comment. I'll talk to you later.